All right, hey friends, let's get some music going, shall we? Hey, Miles.
Presenting Benny Goodman and his music.
Whoa. Careful, buddy. Careful. Let me do some flip over so you can jump up better, all right? There you go. Sorry, it's a terrible mess in here, Miles. It really is. Isn't it a mess? Right back. Hey, Chris.
Benny Goodman, ladies and gentlemen, the man with the torrid clarinet and the even more torrid band who purveys assorted rhythms, all danceable, in the urban room of the Congress Hotel in Chicago. And first of all, one of Irving Berlin's greatest hits, Blue Skies.
Hey, Susan, Vicky, Kathleen, Cindy, Marie. Hey, Gladys, Mona, Octavio, Pat. Hey, Kendra. Anybody I might have missed there? Probably some Buffalo Trace. There's a little bit of hot water. Hey, Jordana. Hey, Mom. Yep, next week is time travel pub crawl. For Boxing Day, very British. Hey, Bridget and Mary Jo. There's more mysterious cats. Hey, Jerry Lehman. Tony. Hey, Karen and Timberly. Hey, Betsy. Miles. Oh, that is delicious. Buffalo Trace with a bit of hot water. Maybe too much hot water, but all right. Hey, Eileen, snow here in Chicago, too. Miles. Miles, whatever are you doing? Miles, don't worry. We're going to get you another jump mouse. We'll do that tomorrow, okay? You won't be without jump mouse for long. It might be useful for me. Limoncello with local lemons. That sounds like the kind of thing you do if you're the sort of fancy person who says recipe instead of food hack. Recipe. Yeah, Pat. I came out of a WCPT today, and there was snow on the ground. There wasn't when I went in. Miles. Yeah, I was doing a podcast earlier today. Including the mini tour, this is my 4th gig today. Hit that donate. They're really both very nice ways. The donut button is over. I was going to get this spatial awareness thing down sooner or later. Yeah, Timothy. Miles, please watch your stuff, my stuff, okay?
Presents Helen Ward singing With All My Heart.
Hey, Miles. It snows sometime between about 5 and 6:30. at the radio station. Some Miles. Hey, Diane. Turn the bunny down a little bit. You might be able to hear Miles purring. Hey, Chuck. Yes, indeed. Miles. I always know if I want some Miles time, I just put the computer up here. He knows this is time for Miles' attention. Sincerely with all my heart. Hey, Susan. This big guy. Remember he was just little? We are approaching a 5-year anniversary of this. Wow. Telling of the miracle that came along. Am I gonna go sledding? I don't know if there's enough snow for sledding yet. Or likely there won't be on a weekday soon. It might snow some more tomorrow. But then we got the weekends when it'll all be worn out by other people sledding. Ah, Miles.
Benny Goodman goes way back and gets a lot of rhythm out of Walk, Jenny, Walk. Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
Miles, you do break things, don't you? Miles is just about exactly 1 year old when we started all this. And now he's 5. Going on 6. Hey, Susan. Blizzard in Wisconsin. We didn't get that. Miles, are you a heartbreaker? They say in the comments you're a heartbreaker. You're a computer breaker, for one thing. Hey, snowing in Nebraska, too. Or windy in Nebraska. All right. Nebraska, as Grandma Bell calls it. Missouri and Nebraska. Yeah, Miles is 5. Where's Priya? She might be in here. Miles.
And they all loved it. They all loved those Fastons when they played by Benny Goodman. And now another one just in the same vein, Rosetta.
Miles. All right, Miles. You just sit right there, all right? Hey, Al. I will pet Miles from up north. This is from Al up north, Miles. He's on Twitch. Hey, Heather. We got some still. Let me go see if it's still coming down over there. You gotta look at the street light, but it's coming down. Hey, Nance Drew. Hey, Leah. Yeah, I've got a find a grave planned for tomorrow, but if the roads are bad, maybe I'll have to go someplace closer. I gotta do so much cleaning and fixing stuff tomorrow anyway. Miles. Hey, Heidi. We're gonna let Benny Goodman finish up this tune, then we will get started properly. Miles. Well, keep being afraid you're going to knock me off the internet here. And that's kind of a problem. Do you know that? Yeah, the more snow, the more likely you are to get to a Mount Trashmore tour this year. We didn't get to do much sledding last year. Miles, it's about time to get down, you know. But all right, that is Benny wrapping it on up, which means it is time for me to get back onto here. And here we are. Miles, we're going to put you down, all right? You might be hopping right back up. But all right, welcome along, everybody. I'm Adam for Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for going on more than 20 years now. We have got Mysterious Chicago, the book, Flickering Empire, How Chicago Invented the U.S. Film Industry, Smart Alex Guide to American History, the last royalty check of which got me almost enough for a Happy Meal. Extraordinary, I don't know why I have that one in the deck, but all right, Murder Maps USA, and of course, most important for this, Graceland Cemetery, Chicago's stories, symbols, and secrets. All about Graceland Cemetery. This past month, I started officially working on Volume 2. So, very excited about this. You'd think I had covered everybody in the first one, but there were a lot that I had to leave out, and 4 more years of research. Of course, I found a lot more people, some of whom I'm really kind of surprised about. In fact, let me quick, before we really get started here properly, there is somebody I'm going to need to get a picture of here. Here we go. That'll be very easy. All right. Well, I'll just have that ready to go. So, all right. So what we're going to be doing today is talking about women who are interred at Graceland Cemetery. And, of course, there are lots of those, but lots of them to pick from, lots of great stories. Some of these people are very famous, others not so famous, but their stories are just as interesting. And there's nowhere near enough time. I try to keep these to about a 45-minute, 40-minute length, and of course we could go on and on and on and on and on with this. So we'll just it's just kind of a selection today. Of course, we'll start on moving right on in. Oh, where are we going here? That never did open up. Let's just start here, down the hill on the inside. Heather Extraordinary was a very strange book, but that year, just everybody had to have vampires in the book. I consider it non-canon. But all right. So down here at Graceland Cemetery, past the Sherman plot and across the road from Eternal Silence, is the Kinsey family. Let's kind of loop around here. The headstones climbing up the hill. So that's John Kinsey there, but over onto the side, on the edge, on the far right there, is Juliet Kinsey, whose image I see has disappeared from this. The problem with having your cat break your computer and needing a new one is sometimes the proper pictures are not downloaded. But this is Juliet Kinsey, a copy of a painting by the guy who did all of the Graceland people portraits. GPC Healy, but a copy of it made by her granddaughter, who will come up again in a second here. So Juliet Kinsey was a daughter-in-law of John Kinsey, one of our early settlers. Juliet herself promoted him as the founder of Chicago, which, because of that not being quite accurate, for a long time historians just brushed her off as kind of an unreliable historian. However, we've been reevaluating her in recent years. She's really kind of the founder of Chicago high society. There's a charming anecdote where somebody wrote, "Once I saw Juliet Kinsey wearing pink ribbons and tried to get my mother to wear pink ribbons. She wasn't even 50. Can you imagine?" It's always funny when you see things like this. In her diary, she wrote about things like how much fun they had playing with their pet parrot, which was named Polly. This is her daughter, Nellie Gordon. And Nellie Gordon, we actually do have some grave footage for here that I think is actually downloaded. Eleanor or Nellie, who is buried in Savannah, Georgia, right near her daughter, Juliet Gordon Lowe, who was the founder of the Girl Scouts. They've got this plot up here at a cemetery in Savannah. Juliet Gordon Lowe being over here, so move that picture up. Everything got a little bit out of whack when I moved. But one of the people that we have been covering lately on the morning mini tours, who I was so excited to find out about, is down here at Graceland Cemetery, just south of the pond, where Minnie Minoso and Ernie Banks are interred, is the Columbus R. Cummings family plot, which I only recently realized contained Edith Cummings Munson. You don't really, I didn't expect her to be a major athlete over here. She's just kind of Munsoned out on the other side of the pond, or the other side of the path from the pond. But this is Edith Cummings Munson on the cover of Time magazine. She was the first sportswoman on the cover of Time, one of the first women, period. There were only a couple others before her. This was only about a year old at the time, Time magazine was. But she was a semi-professional golfer. Now, there weren't really any professional women golfers at the time. She was semi-pro, but famous enough at it to be on the cover of Time magazine. There wasn't really a big article about her on the inside. That just isn't what Time was like at the time. She just appeared in their article about golf, but was deemed important enough to be on the cover. She was one of what they called the Big Four socialites in Chicago high society at the time, along with her friend. One of them was Ginevra King, who we found on Find a Grave Friday about 2 weeks ago, who was the inspiration for Daisy Buchanan in The Great Gatsby. Edith herself was the inspiration for the character Jordan Baker in The Great Gatsby. And all of these people knew that they were living in the age of F. Scott Fitzgerald. This side of paradise was their Bible. Edith herself eventually got married to a guy by the name of Munson, and ended up in Europe during World War II. She was living in London during the Blitz and volunteering for the Red Cross. Back in the States, she moved to Washington, D.C. and became a very well-known socialite, very well-known philanthropist. And then people got interested in her again in the 1980s. By this time, she was in her 80s herself, but by then she was a woman who had survived World War II. She had been a part of that Great Gatsby culture that was dying off at the time. There weren't a lot of people left from that. So if they wanted stories, they would seek her out. And there's a fantastic interview she gave right towards the end of her life where she said what she'd really like to do now, what she thinks would be really entertaining, is to meet a really vulgar person. It doesn't seem like it'd be that hard, but there we have it. Let's move over here a little bit. Right up towards the front. It's usually the end of the tours when I do a walking tour. But this is Elizabeth Ellie Gridley Butler, the great-great-grandmother of Gerald Ford, but also this plaque here, real daughter, means that her father was in the Revolutionary War. Her father was a guy named Theodore Gridley, who married Amy Ellie, hence her middle name here. Amy Ellie at the time of their marriage was about 40, and Theodore, I think, was about 50, which as age gaps go for Revolutionary War veterans, not bad. But it was 10 years later that Amy gave birth to Elizabeth, 1826. Amy was 50 years old at the time. Now, I've never been able to find a picture of Elizabeth. There is a picture of her daughter, Amy, namesake of Amy Ellie. So this is her. You kind of have to blink. It's a blurry enough picture they wouldn't let me use it in the Graceland book. But that is Elizabeth's daughter, looking like Whistler's mother's grandmother, with little baby Gerald Ford on her knee. And here's the wild thing about this is when this picture was taken, Elizabeth, this sitter's mother, was still alive and would be for another several years. She lived to be well into her 90s. Amy, her mother, lived to be 99. Let's keep on moving. There's so many to cover. Of course, there's no way I'll get to every one. Now, this is a space up here that they told me they're working on getting marked now. It's a difficult person to talk about because she's been kind of screwed over. I say screwed over, but there's been a lot of articles about her that are not very well sourced or very well researched. But it's right over here, there's a presently unmarked grave for a woman by the name of Sarah Good, who was the first black woman in Chicago to get a U.S. patent. Now, for a while, there was a flurry of articles saying she was the first black woman, period, to get a U.S. patent. There was a few earlier ones have been identified by now. But this is her signature in some of the legal archives paperwork. Now, Sarah invented a folding bed that folded into a cabinet, kind of an early version of a hide-a-bed. And we can kind of exaggerate this. I see people all the time saying she invented the folding bed, which there were lots of folding beds on the market by then. It had been for hundreds of years. Advertisements for her cabinet bed actually compared it to the other ones that were on the market. It was lighter, it was cheaper, it was more efficient. She invented it specifically to sell in a furniture store that she ran with her husband. Now, one of the interesting things to me about her is there's a lot of paperwork about her in the legal archives, and it shows just how many lines of credit she was able to get, even back in the 1870s, 1880s, without even having her husband co-sign, which would have been unusual. You tend to hear it was illegal even for white women, and I kind of wonder if she might have been passing as white. There's been a lot of speculation. There's not a lot we know. There's a lot of her paperwork says that she's from Spain originally, which suggests to me that she was telling people that she was Spanish. You see, there's a lot of these articles about her that have pictures that are not her. One of them is just a random person. One of them is a white Mormon missionary who also happened to be named Sarah Good. There's a picture book about her that says that she was born enslaved. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. It just kind of makes the story more dramatic. So it kind of bothers me when people say things like that. Like we need that to, like we need to say it was the first ever folding bed. I don't think it diminishes her accomplishments at all that we should need to exaggerate like this. But it is very cool to go through paperwork and actually see her signature on things like this. Let's move along over here. Up on top of this mausoleum, another person who is not actually marked. Now, unmarked doesn't necessarily mean rich or poor. I just realized there's a family mausoleum for a guy here who could have been interred there, but actually has no known marker anywhere, and he founded United Airlines. But this is a marker for a guy named Charles Hosmer. His mother, Ann Hosmer, was a volunteer at the Soldiers' Home during the Civil War and wrote a whole memoir about her experiences that have never been published. I know I put some of it up on the Patreon at one point. There's a manuscript that you can get at the Chicago History Museum in their special collections where she talks about her experiences during the Civil War. There were trips they made on relief missions out to the front and had some very wild experiences. They nearly got killed in somebody's cabin. But also she worked at the Soldiers' Home. And she described one time, this came up in the news quite a bit, that one day a guy came in who worked for the Chicago Times. This was the Copperhead paper. This was the anti-Lincoln paper. This was the pro-slavery paper. And she said, I would rather have my hand chopped off than work for a paper like that. And of course, Wilbur F. Story, the editor, just absolutely went nuts, talked about the intolerance of the soldiers' home. Which is it very much like nowadays whenever somebody punches a Nazi, how tolerant. This is exactly the same thing, what happened to Ann Hosmer. And she offered to resign, but the president of the Soldiers' Home, Thomas Barber Bryan, who was also the founder of Graceland Cemetery, insisted that she stay. Now, we're kind of in a theme right here of people who had the good sense to oppose the Chicago Times. Just on the other side of the hill from Ann Hosmer is Clarissa Wilson. Now, Clarissa Wilson and her husband, James. I don't have a picture of her. There is one of James who was quite a bit younger. Yeah, quite a bit younger. She was into her 80s and he was 72. There's a picture of him where he looks like Santa Claus's grandfather with a big flowing white beard. Clarissa lived with him in Winnetka. Her mind was not as sharp by the end of her life. She had a caretaker coming in to be with her most days. But there was a time when somebody brought her a present that was wrapped in an issue of the Chicago Times. And she was so horrified that somebody would give her something wrapped in the Chicago Times that she threw the entire package into the fire. But she and James were both murdered one grim night in the 1880s, and one night in 1884. There was never a known suspect for it, or any real motivation for it. The only suspect was a butcher who was quickly acquitted. Clarissa was killed with her son's old Civil War sword, which some people said was just sort of the result of the continuing original sin of the United States. So let us move on, though. Let's cover briefly here. Up and around and around. This is an interesting one. Now, to the right here, this smaller white one is arguably one of the very few marked graves for a Great Chicago Fire victim, but it's not a direct victim. It was a baby who died of smoke inhalation from the Great Chicago Fire, but held on for a couple of months afterwards. But the marked one is for the baby's mother, Harriet Hubbard Ayers, who ended up being a beauty columnist for the New York World. At one point, she is thought to have been the highest paid journalist in the country. As such, it's tempting to think of her as kind of a proto-feminist. Her writings do not really reflect this. It was all about your duty to stay looking young. But on the other hand, she did empower women in a way to take control of how they looked, to take control of that aspect of their personality. And, you know, how people look and how people dress does impact how they feel. And we're kind of stretching when we say that. You read some of her stuff now, and it's just not exactly future perfect. But still, this was one of the most highly paid journalists of her era, if not the most highly paid. There's not necessarily data about that. Well into the 20th century, they were still publishing Harriet Hubbard Ayers dolls. I want to get into people who are more interesting to a modern audience. I can never get enough of talking about Elizabeth Getty. Kieran suggests I should do a year's best of tours for the year's end. Which are the best? We'll move around the bend here. Let me rest my voice a little as my fourth gig of the day. The Sullivan grave is over on the other side of the pond from here. But this is a Louis Sullivan designed mausoleum designed for Henry Getty, who was a lumberman around the time his wife Carrie died. But we can get so hung up on the architecture of it, the fantastic Louis Sullivan architecture, that one does forget that there's a really interesting person interred here. And Henry Getty seems like he was a pretty interesting guy. But his daughter Alice, and the only photos I could get of Alice were her passport photos, really. But Alice grew up wanting to be a composer, and actually had sheet music published all over the place. I had a friend record one of her songs called Pluie, French for rain. But her father was also a big collector of art, and she got that bug as well and became not only a collector, but an expert on Asian art, and even published a book called The Gods of Northern Buddhism, Their History, Iconography, and Progressive Evolution Across the Northern Buddhist Countries. As it sounds, it's a very scholarly book. You cannot get any of her personality out of it. Believe me, I read through it and tried. But then during World War I, she was living in France and started a Braille printing press for soldiers who had been blinded. After World War I, she spent some time living in a monastery in Japan with a sect of Buddhist monks from a sect that are still not really that well understood. Years later, she was working on a manuscript about her time there, but then she was back in France. The Nazis raided her villa and burned the manuscript. So she drifted back to the United States, where she spent the last years of her life studying Ilyana, the Syrian goddess of love. Never married or had kids, but there was a woman who was her study partner. So the 21st century gives us certain ideas. That's kind of how I summarize the relationship anyway. But when you go through newspaper articles about her, a lot of times she'll be talking about things like Buddhism and talking about Asian art. And usually the tone of the article is like, oh, look what this high society girl is up to now. It's very strange to read. There's a definite disconnect. And I suppose newspaper reporters were used to high society girls getting up to strange hobbies. But this is something that she was very, very serious about. Well, let us move on. It's another very cool one. There's a couple of interesting people in the plot here. One that we'll be focusing on. Right over here, we've got the Shaw Judson family marker. And up at the top there, you can just see a little of it. I wasn't really focusing on the family monument here, but the family monument has this green ball on top that is like an old IBM Selectric typewriter ball. But the words on it spell out the Lord is my shepherd, the 23rd Psalm. But right here, it is the family plot of the architect Howard Vander and Shaw, but also here is his daughter Sylvia Shaw Judson, who is best known as a sculptor, perhaps in particular best known for having carved the Bird Girl sculpture that was on the cover of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. This used to be at a cemetery in Savannah, but became too vulnerable to theft there, so now it is in a museum. But she also did some sculpting around Chicago. She had a place up in Lake Forest, Ragdale. Ragdale was like an artist colony in a neighborhood where most of the houses look like murder mystery houses. But in Chicago, she carved the Spirit of Electricity, which you can see as a fresco on a power station near Block 37 on Dearborn. Kristen, I know, has got like a small version of this that I am very jealous of. We're going to see it. I got to figure out where that came from. Not that I have a lot of room to put new things around in here. Well, let's move on a little bit. We're going to backtrack a little. And just down the road. But I love that Spirit of Electricity one. It looks like the Hulk. I'm going to need some more bourbon here soon. So there's a whole section around here, and really all around the pond and extending beyond. It's almost, you could almost make a running joke out of so many of the stories here. It's like, here's an interesting plot, but there's a woman in the plot who is way more interesting than the guy. In that case, there's this is the plot of Philip Armour, of Armour Hot Dogs. Feel free to get that song stuck in your head. And in the plot with him is his granddaughter by marriage, Alexandra. It's this fantastic picture. Like high fashion Santa Claus right here. Or look at this. They had designers then. So her name was Alecky Armour on the gravestone, but by birth she was Alexandra Romanov Galzatine of Russia. She was a Russian princess, quite literally a princess, a member of the Russian royal family, who was imprisoned by the Bolsheviks for a while, escaped to England, and then to the United States, where she just worked at Marshall Fields for a while. And the press loved this, the story of the royal shop girl. How later on, when asked about this, she said, "I would never wish to be rich. It is a great nuisance. I would like to make money, yes, and my husband too. It is that we are earning it and not selling our name, but just enough to live on decently." And I'm sure she did live on decently. If you're married into the Armour family, you probably do. But she spent a lot of her life just volunteering in a hospital gift shop. And when she died just in 2006 at the age of 101, one of her grandchildren said all she really wanted out of life was a hardback book to read and a glass of orange juice every morning. Now, we can kind of make some rips on the fact that, yeah, it's easy to say you don't need to be rich when you are. But, I don't know, when you're being rich has led to you being kidnapped by the Bolsheviks when you were a child, you can just kind of see things differently. Next plot over. Next plot over is the Medill family plot. Now, the back side of it are a couple of Joseph Medill's children and granddaughters. And one of his daughters had the best last words of anyone in the cemetery. In her villa, in her estate in France, she was watching a maid walk away and said, "My God, what a bottom," and then died. But also here is his granddaughter, Eleanor Sissy Patterson. We talked about her a little bit on the morning mini tour just the other day. I was putting together a video for a new British TV show and suggested that they include a little bit about Sissy Patterson. Now, Sissy was a newspaper editor herself, like her grandfather before her. She ran a paper under the Hearst Syndicate in D.C., and it's very interesting to go back and read some of her articles. My favorite is one where she tried to interview Albert Einstein. She went to the house where he was staying, and they said, yes, the professor's just around back. So she went around back, and there was Albert Einstein wearing nothing but a handkerchief over his face. He was sunbathing, so she decided, I'll let the professor be. Now, not that she was intimidated by nudity or anything. Most of the biographies of her have focused a little bit more on her love life than anything else. So she left the professor be, but a couple of nights later, she went to the premiere of Charlie Chaplin's City Lights. And there was Einstein sitting right next to Chaplin and dabbing at his eyes all through the movie with probably the same handkerchief that had been covering him up. And she wrote, it doesn't really matter to me whether the universe is infinite or finite. What matters is the man who knows is still moved to tears by the little tramp. I thought that was fantastic. Now, I mentioned we spend more time today talking about her wild and crazy love life than anything else. I think this is actually a better way to honor her memory than talking about her writing. Other than a couple of anecdotes like the great Einstein article or her interview with Al Capone, her politics were really awful. Now, it wasn't that she liked Hitler. She just thought people were making too big of a deal out of it. She would be right there talking about Hitler derangement syndrome nowadays. Well, let's move on. Who's a little tramp act Phoenix? Miles is. We'll pass. Mrs. Holmes here was a real estate developer and investor in the 1930s. Slowly creeping away. Is it just me, or do I see comments slightly faster than I used to? It used to seem like about 20 seconds later I would see the comment. Now I feel like we're down to 10 now. That should help her find a grave. But here we are, Edith Rockefeller McCormick. Edith was the heir to the Standard Oil name and money. In the plot with her are a couple of her children whose deaths from scarlet fever led her to start the McCormick Institute of Infectious Disease, which never did find a vaccine against scarlet fever. They found one that they administered, but it turned out not to be as effective as just antibiotics would eventually be. But they did develop a vaccine against diphtheria, which did not completely wipe out diphtheria, but now every couple of years somebody gets it, instead of 200,000 people a year. So she was born into the Rockefeller family, married into the McCormick family, and by some estimates was the richest woman in the world at one point. But then after her death, by that time she was divorced, there was really nothing set aside for what to do with her remains. And Graceland just kept her in the vault for decades. It wasn't until the 1950s the McCormick family decided we should do something with the remains of old Edith, even though Harold had divorced her left her for an opera singer of questionable talents. There was just recently a very interesting biography of her published, though it kind of glosses over the main reason she made the news in her lifetime, which was claiming to be the reincarnation of King Tut's first wife. And all of the other high society people just had to kind of nod along with it, because after all, she was highly educated. She had actually was a trained analyst who had studied under Carl Jung. While we're on the Ediths, Edith Ogden Harrison, wife of Carter Harrison V, who usually went by Carter Harrison Jr., which makes these things a little bit more annoying than they need to be. Edith Ogden Harrison was the unofficial hostess of the 1933 World's Fair. She was a very famous children's book author at the time. And also wrote a fantastic book about growing up in New Orleans in the 1870s. And this is the time when New Orleans was really kind of becoming the New Orleans that we think of it as. She was a good friend with the essayists that they kind of credit with inventing New Orleans, or like the whole atmosphere that we think of. I feel like if he hadn't done it, somebody else would have. But right behind them, of course, there's only one mausoleum at Graceland that I know of that was built specifically for a woman and contains no adult men. And that is the tomb of Lavinia Lane, which was in better shape when I filmed this, I think. It's been falling apart for a long time. It's probably worth noting they don't open the door to this one to check for structural damage or anything. They're kind of afraid it might be a load-bearing door at this point. So the whole thing might come tumbling over. There hasn't been family around in a very, very long time. But Lavinia Lane we also don't know very much about. About the only thing that comes up is the story about the time when she was in her 70s, went into the office of Judge Van H. Higgins, also in his 70s, and started cussing him out and beating him up. They got into one hell of a rowdy now, by all accounts, busted windows and everything. Not unlike, I just was in a coffee shop that had a sign that you can meet Santa and the Grinch. I assume they're going to fight? Come on, who you got? But they knocked out several windows, and a couple of days later, it was reported that Lavinia had recently had a couple of bodies disinterred from this tomb to boil them in her kitchen. Now, I have always assumed that was probably a story Judge Van H. Higgins was spreading around. He owed her money. That's why she was beating him up. There was a lawsuit between them. I've got the paperwork on it. It doesn't really clear anything up. He admitted that he knew her from Galena, but that's about it. Well, there's a lot of unanswered questions about Lavinia, like possibly, is she the reason why I got a big rash on my wrist when I tried to see inside of this tomb? Have I in fact angered a witch? Every now and then I slide a buck under the door just to be on the safe side. I take it these down earlier, but I kept having the program crash when I was setting this up today. Over here on the main side of the pond, we'll pop this up. Ruth Pige, I love this one. I feel like you can tell so much about this woman just by the design here. She was a dancer, Ruth Pige. Still a very famous name in dance to this day. She got her start as a teenager dancing what were called the Pavlovites, young women who danced with Anna Pavlova. Loved telling stories about seeing Anna Pavlova naked. Enough to make you wonder. And in fact, in the 1930s, she choreographed a ballet that had a lesbian couple in the background. I think it was kind of blink and you miss it, but it was there. I love this shot of her in, what was this one called? I got this out of the Chicagoan magazine, I think. She's dancing to Rhapsody in Blue here. Think how modern this must have seemed in the 1920s. And there she is as, I don't think she's specifically supposed to be Queen Amidala, but I'm going to go ahead and say, yeah, Queen Amidala there. You know, late in life, she said, oh, why are you interviewing me? The only thing interesting about me is that in my place in France, I live next to Brigitte Bardot, and I've been mugged 3 times. But she was still wearing a leotard under her clothes right up to the end, and talking about really risque ballets that she wanted to stage. At one point, she said, you know, if you only did what people thought you ought to do, you'd be awfully limited. I love that quote. But over on the other side of the pond here, you can see this Parthenon, really. Designed by McKim, Mead & White of New York. This is Bertha Palmer is here. She was only 13 when she first met Potter Palmer. He was into his late 20s or so. And according to legend, he saw her and said, as soon as she's old enough, I'm going to marry her. Which today gives us the ick in a major way. At the time, it just didn't bother people to hear things like that. But honestly, good pick on his part. Bertha Palmer was just as good a business person as Potter himself was, really. After his death, after he had founded the department store that gradually became Marshall Field's and founded the Palmer House Hotel, Bertha, the undisputed queen of Chicago high society, doubled the size of their estate. Made a lot of the money by pretty much inventing Sarasota, Florida. At the time, the railroads didn't go there. She had to lobby the railroads to build more tracks. She got involved in things like experimental farming down there. She encouraged more and more people to build and buy down there. But really, she was also friends with a lot of the major artists. This is a painting of her by Anders Zorn. She was friends with a lot of the Impressionists and bought their paintings back when they cost $30. Great portion of the Art Institute's holdings are now the old Bertha Palmer collection. She was head of the women's department for the World's Fair of 1893. And her will is a pretty entertaining read. I've talked a lot about how high society stuff seems just so distant and unimportant now. But it is kind of amusing to read a will that has things like a bequeathment to my longtime footman, and one to whoever my current footman is at the time of my death, and to my current cook and to my longtime cook. It's all very high society stuff. Speaking of high society, there were also people who just commented on high society. It's one of my favorite pictures of anybody at the cemetery. And one thing, in cemetery books, I tend not to use too many photographs of people because come on, they all have the same haircut. But up here on this outcropping that we sometimes call Pride Rock, because it looks like a scene from The Lion King when the coyotes posed there. Good night, Bob. Hope you're having a good trip. Just here is Carolyn Kirkland, who is better known as Madam X. Here she is. I think this is a big enough version of the picture I can just zoom in on this thing. There with what can only be described as a shit-eating grin. Madam X was the society columnist for the Chicago Tribune. Her writing was excellent, got involved in a lot of preservation efforts, involved in a lot of reform efforts, and also just commented on high society in such a delightfully detached sort of way. She described her columns as reeking with indiscretion. Her mother said, if you write columns like that, you will never get invited to any dinners. And she just said, well, then I shall have to dine alone. Well, looking back on it now, there's a little bit of amusing stuff. She used to talk about what eligible bachelors people like Robert Allerton and Arthur Meeker Jr. were. They were gay. And she knew them well enough that she may have had a pretty good idea about this. But her columns are really very well written. They're very insightful. Her stuff written about hubris after the sinking of the Titanic are really very fascinating to read now. I should really dig up more of her stuff and start publishing them on the Patreon or something. They really are excellent. Now, just over here in the Knowles section, they call it, a couple of interesting people. Oh, several. For one, we've got Martha DePriest, who was born enslaved. She's photographed right here. The only photograph I could get of her came out of the Chicago Defenders. This just comes out of microfilm. But that was the best version of it I could get. She was born enslaved, but her son Oscar became an alderman and then a United States congressman. There was a thing, one of the guys in the Senate said he was going to physically block Oscar from using the Senate restrooms. And Oscar said, well, I wasn't going to. He was a congressman, not a senator. But now that he's said that, I've got a mind to go over there and see if he's big enough. And over nearby is her daughter-in-law, Oscar's wife, Jessie. Right next to Oscar, moving over. I got this a little bit out of order. I had this a little bit out of space. Jesse, Oscar's wife, upon his election in the 1920s, was invited to tea with Mamie Hoover, along with all the other congressional wives. They had a tea party. It was a very standard thing, and even the more progressive papers were saying she should have just said that she found herself unable to attend. It stirred up an absolute storm of controversy. The senator who was responsible for writing the text of the Prohibition Amendment said that this incident was one that he deplored beyond all measure because it was fraught with peril for white civilization. That a congresswoman's wife had been invited to tea. And she brushed the whole thing off, saying it was all really just stirred up in the press. We had a lovely evening having tea, discussing the same sort of things we discuss at church. But Oscar was having absolutely none of it. She, as she would have had to be, was just trying to remain calm through the whole thing, whereas Oscar was having none of that. He said, okay, if you're not voting for any of the civil rights stuff, I'm not voting for any of the prohibition stuff. Now, in a couple of weeks, I will be doing a talk on Frank Lloyd Wright at the Chicago for Chicagoans lecture series. And I think starting in a couple of weeks, we're going to move these tours over to Wednesday. Just for the duration of Chicago for Chicagoans. So I know we ended up clashing with that a lot. So starting like after mine, I'm one of the first ones. Right here in this columbarium, first of all, we've got Barbara Langtot is the author of one of the other Graceland Cemetery books, and I've met her. She is fantastic. She's really fun to talk to. But also right here is Marion Mahoney Griffin, who was the first woman to be licensed as an architect in Illinois. And she worked in the office of Frank Lloyd Wright for a while and described him later as a canker sore who stole from everybody and killed the Chicago movement of architecture. Did not mince words on the guy, but also made him famous. Her landscape paintings of her work that resembled Japanese landscape paintings were really what made Frank Lloyd Wright famous. Well, that and all the sex scandals anyway. She ended up marrying Walter Burley Griffin. Now, whether her name is pronounced Mahoney or Mahoney, no matter what I say, I get emails about it. I believe she generally went by Marion Mahoney Griffin. More typical pronunciation would be Mahoney, but man, do I get emails no matter what I say. I believe she went by Mahoney. But she tended to stay kind of quiet and behind the scenes, though she did write an autobiography that went for about 1,000 pages and was finally published by the Art Institute just a few years ago. And we've got another one that is unmarked, almost certainly by her own choice. She made a big deal in her will saying, no ceremony, nothing whatsoever. So there was recently a book of Chicago grave photographs that talked about her and just showed this one, which is close to where she is. It just doesn't really happen to be her grave. A woman named Mary Hastings Bradley, whose writings about travels in Africa were a big inspiration for Teddy Roosevelt to go on safari. And she conquered jungle after jungle, in the parlance of the day. But travel writing was not really a great way to make a living. She made more of her money writing mystery novels, some of which are still available today. But also, after World War II, she was sent overseas to look at the remains of the concentration camps, the death camps, and wrote that if D-Day had come a little bit later, it would have been too late. She believed that the Nazis were developing missiles that could have gotten all the way across the ocean undetected very quickly. Her writings about it never really did come out. Her daughter, Alice, had a successful career as a science fiction writer under the name James Tiptree Jr. Are they on Tuesdays this year? I gotta double check that. That would make things easier around here, wouldn't it? Yeah, 7th is a Tuesday. How about that? I should double check. All right, Mary Richardson Jones. John and Mary were the first black couple to really get rich in Chicago. Jon Jones, her husband, ran a cleaning and tailoring business that made him an absolute fortune, and he would actually literally take out ads in Frederick Douglass's newspaper saying, if you escape, get to Chicago, I'll find you a job, I'll loan you money, whatever it takes. Now, Mary, his wife, was involved in the cause as well. She was helping to shelter people in their house until they could get them on the ship that would take them to Detroit and Hamilton, Ontario. There was a time that John Brown, the radical abolitionist who was trying to start his own civil war, knocked on the door with several of his fighters that he'd recruited. And she told John, I don't know if I want these guys in my house. These are the roughest looking guys I have ever seen in my life. And John said, just hold them for a while until I can get some money to get them on a train. So she had them in, found a guy who was about John Brown's size, and sent him to State Street to have a suit made. That was the story she would have to tell over and over again for the rest of her life. Later on, it took her a while to get involved in the suffrage cause. Like a lot of women of her generation, she started out kind of skeptical of the whole thing, but eventually did come around to the cause, and also was a major part of Chicago's Black High Society, member of things like the Prudence Crandall Club, but generally mixed with people like Bertha Palmer. Let's move down here a bit. Oh, I have gone way over time, but we'll just keep going. We'll throw in one more here then. It's always nice to extend this one. On the other hand, this is my fourth gig of the day. So this is the Pinkerton family plot. And over off to the side, the Pinkerton detective plot. Including, this has been cleaned quite a bit since then, since this was filmed. But right there, the largest of the Pinkerton detectives is Kate Warren, who is sometimes considered the first woman detective. And you know me, I'm always hesitant to call anybody the first anything. There's always somebody else with another claim on it. But she was certainly the first to work for Pinkerton and helped sneak Abraham Lincoln into Washington, D.C. Later on, she was in charge of the jail in Washington, D.C., where she was probably helping people escape. A lot of the people held there were just what they called contraband at the time, escaped and captured enslaved people. She ended up heading the Secret Service in Washington, D.C. They found that having a woman there, I believe, was good for working into the confidences of the wives of Copperhead congressmen, trying to find out what was going on. So a couple of years after that, she would have been back in Chicago, died of congestive lung failure, and this is pretty much all we can really tell you about her. There's really not much that is really known about Kate Warren. There have been a lot of books about her out in recent years, but they're really not much more than fan fiction. However, she has become kind of a cult figure in her own right. She is one of the first women detectives that we know anything about, certainly. Last I heard, Emily Blunt had signed on to play her in a movie upcoming. All right. Whoa! You see in double. 4 atoms. There, all right. So, Upcoming, as many of you have guessed, it probably should have been this week. I forgot how close to the holidays we really are. So next week on Boxing Day, Time Travel Pub Crawl presents Drink Like the Dickens. I got some new footage while I was in the UK for this one, as you guessed I would. I didn't have a chance to make it over to the Grapes. I really wanted to go to the Grapes. But I did get some new stuff that we can throw in for this one. It's going to be a lot of fun. So Time Travel Pub Crawl next week, Drink Like the Dickens. I'm Adam for Mysterious Chicago. We will put up the thank you note right over here, the donate button. Thanks for joining me. Here's Benny Goodman once again. Hey, JK, down in Urbana. Yeah, stick to Buffalo Trace tonight? Yeah. Thanks, everybody, for popping in. Next week, Time Travel Pub Crawl presents Drink Like the Dickens. I will get that posted up shortly. In fact, now I'll get it up now. Get up in the other windows. I don't know who might be watching. I've been talking with an ITV show lately, an upcoming one. Get that copy right now. Copy event. Welcome along, everybody. Those of you just joining us, you have now hit the post-show hang. I'm kind of racing to get Time Travel Pub Crawl for next week posted. Alright, the posting is already in good shape. That's good to see. I don't have to change too much to it. Thanks to those of you popping in donations here. Those, of course, brighten my evening. Alright, that'll put it on the page anyway. I'll add it to Facebook in a couple days. I should give a tour in New Orleans. I'd have to do some research there. I have actually been asked to go do a vampire tour there. The stories that I've been told from the vampire tours there do not hold up to fact-checking. Like, at all. Okay, well, Chicago for Chicagoans isn't live streaming. I'll just set up my phone.
And that would put rhythm in the feet of a wooden Indian.
Thank you for tuning in, Spencer.
Goodman's own arrangement. Now, the popular tune, Thanks a Million.
Oh, thanks. Paulo, those are Ronnie's decorations. I'll figure out a New York tour soon. I gotta go there. I gotta go to Tulsa again. Now, Aaron, when I do a True Crime in Chicago Cemeteries tour, it's basically a Mount Carmel tour. Diane, we see you there. Look, the Dylan Archives did not appear to have the street-legal piano demos. I know a guy in New York who's got them, and if you go over to his place, he'll play them for you. Oh yeah, you know, Kristen, I had almost forgotten the time that I had to take off my belt to get into Trinity Church, and then my pants about falling down in front of God and everybody. I remember New Year's Eve, 1999. I decided, there was all this talk about this is when he's coming back. So I decided at the stroke of midnight I would drop my pants. And I did. I ran around the yard. My sister shouted, I don't know him, so I ran around shouting, I'm Cassidy's brother. This is shorts, Good night, Eileen. Good night, Eileen. Good night, Eileen. Spencer, I don't know if anything's going to come up with my name in Jewish cemetery. Specifically. Look up Graceland Cemetery. I mean, it'll come right up. Or Trinity. Strange thing about Trinity Churchyard is pretty much all of the historians who worked on that job have been Jewish. Yeah, I have been working on a Jewish Graceland tour, but that hasn't. There's a lot of work to put in that goes into these things. Good night, Lynn.
Benny Goodman presents On the Alamo.
Yeah, Spencer, I've been taking notes on the Jewish Graceland one for a while now. It's not quite there, but there's a lot of really good stuff there. It's a much smaller cemetery, so you have to really dig in a little bit harder. It's not, with the really big ones, you can at least start with all of the famous people there. There's a handful there, but not a ton. It just being a smaller cemetery. So without too many people who are particularly famous interred there, you have to, dig with other people. Oh, live stream holiday concert from Melissa Mulder tomorrow night at 7:30. That's excellent. Have a good night, Kristen. Very flattered that anybody would pause Muppet Christmas Carol for the likes of me. I've never seen that in the theater in Merlehain Mall. I'll see any Muppet movie. Got Statler and Waldorf right behind me, heckling me all through this. Oh, ho, ho, ho. Jordana, correct. The one that they took out for the video release, which I always thought stopped the movie cold. Now, Mike, we can usually, you can probably find some mustaches in here. James Wilson, who I mentioned, has a mighty mustache. I just didn't show it.
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and we stay right in the urban room of the Congress Hotel in Chicago and dance some more to Benny Goodman and his orchestra. And
now, Spencer's an interesting case at Jewish Graceland is that not a lot of them are pointed east. There's also very little Hebrew on the gravestones there. Elaine, no, I did not know Waldorf's wife. Susan, I don't think I know that one offhand. It's interesting, though, that he would be at Rose Hills. That was about, he died about 5, from that, it's like he died about 5 years before Rose Hill was a thing. But a lot of people got moved there. If it hollers, let it go, let it fly away. Elaine, that makes sense. I should have guessed.
And we'll let the title speak for itself.
Jordana agreed. Astoria is almost certainly Statler in drag. Oh, we'll let Benny handle one more tune here. Once again, next week, Boxing Day. We're going to be talking about Drink Like the Dickens. One of my favorite of the time travel pub crawls, even it is one of the most complicated. And I had to get some new footage while I was in the UK, so. Good night, Julianne. Oh, I saw Complete Unknown last night. And I enjoyed it very much, but in particular, Ed Norton's Pete Seeger was just incredible. Ed Norton is quite likely to win an Oscar for that. I interviewed Pete one time. He talked just like that. It's a great anecdote. He called up Joan Baez to talk about Pete Seeger. And shows, a lot of us who were from back then are tired of talking about Bob Dylan by now, but we're not tired of talking about Pete Seeger. And his main question is, if Pete hadn't seen you for a long time, is he the kind of guy who would hug you and you just, no. Pat, there are some episodes. There are some recipes. There are some food hacks, some drink hacks on the Eventbrite listing. Alright, this is Benny wrapping up. So once again, Time Travel Pub Crawl next week. Tomorrow, Find a Grave Friday. I have an idea if the roads are okay. So alright, everybody, thanks a lot for joining me. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tour. Presenting 4 gigs today. Stay safe, stay strong, and stay spooky, everybody. I thought the song was over.